Hey guys, John here, and welcome back to the Synthmaster tutorial course. Today we're going to be discussing the custom waveform. So starting off from a default preset, let's hover our mouse over the oscillator display, and we're going to see a couple extra icons up here, and we're going to see this pencil icon here. So let's go ahead and select that. Now this is going to bring up the editor that we'll be using to create our own waveforms. So this editor is split up into four main horizontal sections. The first one is the top bar with various options and modes. Next, we have an editable waveform display. And below that, we have access to edit the waveform spectrum. And then finally, we have a spectral filter down here at the bottom. But first, let's concentrate on the top bar. So at the top left, we can select this display. This says custom waveform, and this is going to bring us a drop-down menu. Here is where we can select different types of waveforms. So maybe you want to start off with something more basic, like a sine wave, a square wave, a saw wave, something like that. Or you might want to have a more complex waveform to start with. Or you can even let Synthmaster generate a random waveform for you. So this is going to be the menu where we find all of that. So for now, let's go into factory, let's go into basic, and let's just go ahead and select the sine wave. We also have these left and right arrows, so if we want to cycle through different waveforms, we can do that as well. We can also go backwards here. We also have an option to save the waveform, but not just as the waveform itself. We can also export this as a WAV file, so we have 8-bit, 16, 24, and 32. And then we also have our undo and redo buttons, which are always really nice to have. So let's go back here to this menu, let's go back to factory, and then go to basic, and then let's select sine one more time. So to the right here, we see an option called type, and by default, this is going to be on segmented. And when this type is selected, we can edit our waveform with points and curves. So these here being the points, and these are going to be the curves where we can change the waveform. And if we want to add more points, all we have to do is double click where we want them, which is going to give us also more curves. And if we want to remove a point, all we have to do is right click on the points that we don't want. So maybe we don't want this one. And then we can maybe bring this up here, and maybe this is going to be the waveform that we want. Let's go ahead and reset to the sine wave. So we go right, and then we can go left again to restore our sine wave. So to the right of the type menu, we have interpolation, and by default, this is going to be selected on curve, which is basically what we were just doing, adjusting these curves here. Now, let's say, for example, we might want to start with a square wave and make something based on that. We can go to this menu, and then we can select on step, and now we can make something interesting. Now, if we go back to our sine wave once again, let's say maybe we want to try something starting off as a triangle. So maybe going linear would be a good starting point for that. And if we start adding new points, we're going to notice that we cannot add any curves here, hence because we're going to be on linear. So now one more time, let's go back to our sine wave, and the next one down here is going to be quadratic. And again, these different modes are going to behave obviously differently, so definitely spend some time and kind of live in one mode for a little bit, kind of play with some waveforms, and then check the other ones out as well. And then if we go back to the sine one more time here, and then we select the menu, and then we go down to cubic, this one's a little more interesting because between each 2 points, we're going to have 2 spots where we can adjust curves. So maybe we can bring this one up here, and then this one down here like that. And let's say we add another point right over here with double click. So now we can adjust a curve here, we can adjust a curve here, and then we also have 2 other ones as well. So like I said, all these modes are different, so spend some time with them and maybe find one that you like. So back here with the sine wave, we have this button here called tie, which is enabled. Now, if we add a point, let's say right over here, we can click this and move this around and change our waveform. Kind of like what we were just doing. Now let's restore the sine wave one more time, and let's turn this off, and let's make another point right up here, kind of in the same area. Now, once we start moving this, we're going to see that we're going to get this vertical line here, which actually gives a really interesting sound to our sine wave. Yeah, so just turning that one off, you can get some really bright and kind of cutting through the mix type of waveforms. So next up, we have grid X and grid Y. So if you want to work with a little bit more precision on a grid basis, this is going to be the option for you. So for grid X, let's go ahead and select this, and we can go up to 32 if we'd like to. However, for this example, let's do something like 16, and then for grid Y, we can choose something like 8. So now once we double click and add a point, we can snap these to the grid if we'd like to. Now, once we're done with the grid and we're happy with our waveform, we can always turn this off if we don't want to stare at the grid the whole time, and our waveform keeps the same shape. Now, something else I wanted to mention is that under type where it says segmented, we can select this and we can go to freehand, and now we can start drawing our own waveform. And also we can draw on a spectrum basis as well. And we also have a zoom factor here as well. So by default, this is going to be on 4. However, we can go up to 16 and get really precise. So an example of this, let's go to a new sine wave. And what we can do is go back to our freehand and maybe make something like an organ. Yeah, lots of possibilities there. So next up, we have the spectral filter. Now for this example, let's load up a saw wave. We can come up here to the top left and click this triangle a couple times, or we can go through the menu. Either way is going to get us there. So now we have a saw wave. Now, the really cool thing about a spectrum filter is that we can define its shape and really make something unique out of it. So let's first turn this on by clicking here on the left-hand side, and let's start drawing some type of shape here, something like a band stop. So in the center, let's put a point here, and then let's bring this down. Let's actually remove this guy with right click, and maybe make something kind of like that, and then one here, and let's bring this one kind of back up here, and do the same thing on the other side. So now we have just this basic shape like that. And basically this hole here is mirroring this shape right over here, and we can even see this a little bit more if we start moving one of these points. Now, filters like this can get incredibly sharp to the point that if we brought these points really close together, we can essentially filter out single harmonics, as we can see down over here. And if we dropped an octave to make it seem a little bit easier to see, we can see that we're kind of taking out these harmonics here. So now you might have noticed is as we play on our keyboard and play different notes, this changes as well. So this filter is actually moving according to the notes that we play in our keyboard. Now this has to do with the key tracking. So if we turn this all the way off and maybe open this up just a little bit like that here, we're going to kind of see our shape down here a little bit more, but let's bring it up a little bit to see this a little bit better. So with this point, we can bring this all the way over here like that and kind of just move these into position, maybe somewhere higher up like that. So now it's roughly in the spot that it was before. So now in this case, we can play all the notes on our keyboard, and this spectral filter is going to be locked into this specific frequency range right over here. So with our spectral filter reset, the next knob we need to talk about is this even and odd mix. Now remember that a saw wave contains all harmonics based on integer multiples of the fundamental frequency, and a square wave contains all odd integer multiples of that fundamental frequency. Meaning that if we remove the even harmonics from a saw wave, it's going to give us a square wave. So right now, take a look at the spectrum view and the oscilloscope, and we're going to see a saw wave here. However, once we start removing the even ones, leaving just the odds, it's going to start turning into a square wave. And all the way to the left here, we just have odd harmonics, and we can see that here on the spectrum view and on the oscilloscope. And all the way to the right, we can go just all even. And double click back to default. So next up, we have the formant shift. Now, as the name suggests, this is going to shift those formants. However, let's draw a shape and see this in action in the spectrum view so we can actually see it here, the changes. But before we do this, make sure our key tracking is set to 0 so we can really see what's going on. So we have our spectral filter enabled. We're on a saw wave. Now let's go over here kind of to the right of the graph and maybe make a point somewhere around here and then make another one kind of like this. So we're essentially just trying to make a point or a formant, something kind of like that. And let's bring this one somewhere up like that and do the same thing on the other side. And what we can do as well is the curve. We can always tighten this up just a little bit. And let's take a listen to see what this sounds like. So we can essentially see what we're doing right over here. And as we start changing the formant shift, so we're shifting this. So imagine we grab this whole filter here and we can kind of move it to the left and to the right. That's essentially what's happening right over here. So next up, we have the peak shift knob. Now, this is going to scale the peaks vertically, which is going to increase the amplitude, whereas the form and shift move those horizontally. So let's take a look and see what this is actually doing. So we have our spectral filter on. We're on a saw wave again. So let's make a point maybe somewhere right here, and let's bring this down, make another point like that, and then maybe make a couple actually here. That might be kind of interesting. Maybe 2 like that, and bring this down, and maybe we can make 3 actually. So bring another one up here and this one down. So we have basically 3 peaks like that. Now if we play some notes, and let's start adjusting the peak shift here. We can see that the amplitude's getting much, much louder up here. Or we can soften those up a little bit, bring it back up, move the formants a little bit. So here's a pretty good example where we can see these 3 peaks pretty obviously, and then we can always bring down the level of those if we'd like to with the peak shift. And kind of just dial them into our liking. So earlier in the video here at the top, we were talking about the type. By default, it's on segmented, and then we can go to freehand to start drawing our own waveform. We have that same functionality, but on a spectral filter basis. So here where it says type, going from segmented to freehand, we can now draw our own type of filter. Now here, the difference is that we don't have access to the formant or the peak shift knob, so keep that in mind if you go to this mode. Okay, so let's say we're happy with our waveform, we're happy with our spectral filter that we drew, and we want to return to the synth and continue working. So on the top right, we see this X here. Let's go ahead and click that. And then with our mouse, let's hover over our display here of our waveform. And we're going to notice on the top right, we have some additional icons that pop up here. Now these arrows are going to cycle through our different waveforms that we have. The random dice button is going to select a random waveform that we have. This pencil tool is where we were here originally, and we can close this again to get back here. And then we have the plus, which we can start creating a brand new single cycle waveform, or we can start creating a new multi-sample, which we're going to talk about later on in the course. So that's it for now. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you learned something, and we'll see you in the next one.